how much absenteeism there is at work. Those kinds of statistics aren't really in that paper. So all we're looking at is how absenteeism rates change when the weather fluctuates. The general result in that paper is that probably the biggest changes you get in absenteeism following an improvement in the weather happens in industries where absenteeism rates are lowest. So it's kind of a counterintuitive result. So I'm not sure exactly where those rates are, but so we across industries, I'm not sure. But we certainly looked at there were 3 different factors that affected absenteeism. One was whether or not the workplace is unionized, because in unionized settings, workers have more job protection, and as a result, it might be less risky for them to shirk and skip days when the weather's really great outside, because you have a union to sort of protect you if in the event that you do get caught and the employer makes an attempt to dismiss you. So we looked at whether or not the workplace is unionized. We looked at whether you're on probation or not. So in most Canadian jurisdictions, if you have been working with your current employer for less than 3 months, they are able to dismiss you without cause, without having to justify why they're dismissing you. So we looked at workers that have been in the workplace less than 3 months or more than 3 months. And then we also looked at the business cycle. So we looked at whether or not this behavior of skipping days, skipping work when it's nice outside, is more prevalent when the economy is in a recession than when it's in a boom. And the logic is that when the economy is in a recession, if I do get caught shirking my work responsibilities and I get fired, it's going to be a lot more costly for me because it's going to be harder for me to replace my job because the unemployment rate is much higher. And so what you get from doing those kinds of comparisons is actually that people appear more likely, or let's put it another way, so that the change in the absenteeism levels when the weather improves, that kind of increment in absenteeism, is largest where you would expect the least absenteeism to be. So that is in recessions, in non-unionized workplaces, and among probationary employees. So that's kind of a counterintuitive result, and there's kind of a bit of an academic explanation of why that is. So the question is, why does the increment in the amount of absenteeism, why is that larger in workplaces where existing absenteeism is the lowest? The idea basically is that the value of being outside and taking a day off to enjoy the weather outside, that's going to be larger for more healthy employees. If I'm not feeling well to begin with, there's not much point of me skipping work to take advantage of the weather because I'm going to want to be in bed, right? So where you get the biggest value or utility, as economists say, from being outside is among the workers that are most healthy. But the idea is that if I work in a workplace where it's already easy for me not to show up to work, then workers that are really healthy, that feel really good and feel like a day off, regardless of the weather, are already not going to be at work. And so the workplaces where what we say is that the inframarginal worker, that is the worker who would otherwise be at work, is the healthiest, is the workplaces where it's costly to skip work, where there's a risk of getting fired, or where I'm on probation, or where there isn't a union to represent me. So those workplaces, you're going to get healthy workers at work, but when the weather improves, those workers have a lot to gain from skipping work. And so you get the biggest change in absenteeism in workplaces where shirking is actually most costly. So that's kind of a counterintuitive result. To me, it's kind of interesting, but I don't know how relevant it is for things in the real world. It certainly appears to be true in the data. So we see weather has its biggest effect on sickness absenteeism, on reported sickness. I mean, whether or not it's legitimate, we're suggesting it's not legitimate, but it has its biggest impact in workplaces where you would expect it to be least likely to happen. So there's, essentially two broad ways to get into Canada. One is a new permanent resident, and another is as a temporary foreign worker. As a temporary foreign worker, you just receive a contract, a temporary contract to work in Canada for a certain number of years. When that contract expires, you have to leave. Usually there's short-term contracts. The biggest temporary foreign worker program are seasonal agricultural workers. So these are essentially fruit pickers working on farms all over Canada. But there's some evidence, but there's also relatively skilled workers that are coming in as temporary foreign workers. The number of temporary foreign workers has increased dramatically in Canada over the past, since the Conservative government came into power. There's some evidence that workers that enter Canada through a temporary foreign worker program do much better in terms of their labor market outcomes than immigrants who arrive through a permanent immigration program, through the point system, for example. And so that's been attributed to the role of employers in selecting these immigrants. So the idea is that in the point system, the usual way to obtain permanent resident status in Canada, the way it works is that you look through a list of criteria try to capture how much skill you have, like how much labor market experience you have, what your schooling is. And the problem with that program, people perceived, was that people would have all these skills, but once they came to Canada, employers didn't recognize these skills and they didn't get the jobs they wanted. So you hear a lot of stories about foreign trained doctors that can't get jobs in Canada and have to drive taxis instead. But if you look at these temporary foreign workers, they appear to be matched really well. If they come to Canada as computer scientists, then they get jobs as computer scientists. And so that's been attributed to the role of employers. And employers are actually selecting these people. The way they're coming into Canada is not because they fit some criteria in a government program. It's that employers have actually hired them from the foreign country and brought them in. So they've already got the job in hand, right? And so they seem to do much better. They hit the ground running when they arrive in Canada. So that's led the government to think that maybe we should allow employers more generally to play a bigger role in immigrant selection, even in permanent immigration programs. That rather than just have a point system, maybe what we should do is have some kind of a point system that does some initial screening, and then put workers into some database where we can see all these workers in this database have the threshold level of skills we need. But then we're going to let employers select from that database. So people aren't going to get admitted to Canada as permanent residents until employers express an interest in these workers. And that's known as what did I say it was? The expression of interest model or something like that? So that's something quite new that they've been using in Australia. There's no real evidence yet. But Australia and New Zealand has been using this model, and Canada hopes to follow it, I think. And so we might see more of that in the future.
Are these just for high-skilled jobs, or is it also for?
So this is what we call economic class immigrants. So these are skilled. This is a skilled migration program. So these are skilled workers. And so the idea is just to let employers play more of a role in selecting these immigrants, so that people don't come to Canada that don't have any job prospects. And then struggle to find jobs when they come here.
So what are the long-term effects of something like this?
It's pure. I mean, it's hard to believe that it wouldn't have an effect, right? If you allow employers to play a greater role, then that just means that when people come to Canada, they've already got a job because they've been selected for a job. So it's hard to believe that, at least in the short term, that's not going to lead to better outcomes, right? It certainly makes it less likely that somebody's going to come here and be unemployed. The question is the longer term outcomes. When you're hired by an employer, I mean, the question is, how long does that employer intend to keep you? If they're just filling short-term labor market needs, they may hire you and then dismiss you, but now you're a permanent resident in Canada. Are you going to have an easy time finding another job? Maybe it was something very unique about that particular job. There's also concerns in those models, I think, about corruption, right? So people, I mean, you can imagine somebody who wants to come to Canada could incentivize an employer to provide them with a letter that says, we have a job vacancy for this person, when there may not be a job vacancy. So yeah, there's an issue about monitoring this kind of a program. I think when governments talk about creating jobs, though, is the current government has been doing. When we look at, the current government has been throwing around a lot of numbers about what's been happening to employment levels since the recession, the financial crisis in 2008. So you hear numbers like 1 million jobs have been created since 2008. And these numbers come from the labor force survey, but it's, of course, awfully hard to attribute who's responsible for creating these jobs. Is it that the government is creating the right conditions for employers to expand their operations, or is a lot of this just completely independent of anything that governments do? I think governments like to take a lot of credit when job growth when there is job growth, but when jobs are declining, then they like to say that this has very little to do with us and more to do with the economy, right? So
I'm just asking because it seems like the numbers are really specific, like 55,000 jobs have been created this month.
Yeah, so that comes from the labor force survey. And the way we measure that they're not actually measuring jobs. What they do is they do some sampling of households in Canada, and they ask people whether or not you had a job last week. And so if I do this every month, which they do, they do this survey in the week containing the 15th day of the month. And we do this every month in Canada. We get a labor force survey. That's where our unemployment rate comes from. And in that, you can then count how many people have jobs, how many people worked in the previous week, and you can compare that from month to month. And so you can count in Canada how many people reported having jobs and compare that employment level across months. And if it went up by 2,000 jobs, then that tells you that there must be 2,000 jobs in 1 month that weren't there in the previous month.
What does it mean today when more people are getting a university degree? Like, the question now shifts from, just go get a degree, to what kind of degree are you getting?
So what do you mean? Was that not always true that there was some? So I'm not sure what the question is. So we care more about what kind of degree you're getting?
What kind of degree you're getting, as
whereas
opposed to just getting a university degree. Yeah.
So like in the 1960s and 70s, it was fantastic to get a degree and nobody really questioned you on what you were going to study. Today, if you say I'm going to university, your mother or father or uncle and aunt might say, well, what are you doing it in? And if you say you're doing it in X, Y, or Z, they might not be so impressed that you're going to university.
They're more likely to suggest something or go do this as opposed to...
Right. Rather than get that degree in economics, why don't you go and become a plumber or a carpenter and get a real job? Yeah, so this isn't right up my research area, but it certainly is labor economics, so I know a little bit about it. I mean, there's increasing concerns that the value of university degrees has changed over time. And there's a perception out there, certainly in the popular press, that the value has declined over time and that the value of a skilled trade has gone up. So where does that perception come from? A lot of it's anecdotal, so we hear a lot about people with university degrees that are working in Starbucks. And then on the other hand, we hear a lot about the resource industry, the oil industry in Alberta, and extremely high wages for skilled tradespeople, welders and electricians. And so we take stories like that and we make big grandiose statements that this is what's happening in society, that university is just not worth our time anymore, and that we're better off going to college and getting a trade. In the data, it's hard to find much evidence of that. So if you compare the earnings of people with university degrees to people without university degrees, that kind of premium that you see in the data has not been declining over time. And even in recent years, there's not much evidence that in general that has been declining. It may be in certain fields it has, and it's also probably true that the jobs that people get have been changing. So there's evidence that you're more likely to get a job that's not fully commensurate with those skills you might have you might have learned at university, but you're still better off going to university than not doing anything. What's clearest is that there has been a hollowing out of the skill distribution. So there used to be a lot of jobs that were kind of medium level skills, and those jobs have disappeared, or there's much fewer of them. So jobs nowadays are either very low levels of skill or very high levels of skill, and there's not a lot in between. So that we know for sure. But I think the bigger issue is that all this talk about skill shortages and that you're hearing about these days, my sense is that a lot of it is based on these kind of anecdotal stories. And when you go to the data, often there's not much evidence of these things. And then when you look at the big picture data.
So hear a lot about like mismatching between what is available, the jobs that are available now versus the kinds of skills that people have out of university compared to, I guess, college or...
Yeah. Well, as I said, I mean, if that's true, if that was a large-scale problem, of course, anecdotally, there are people that have difficulties getting jobs coming out of university, no question. But if this was a large-scale problem, you definitely should see in the data that the earnings of the average earnings of new university graduates should be declining over time relative to people with college or high school. And that just doesn't appear in the data. I mean, we're just not seeing that in the data. So it doesn't seem to match with the data. If that does start to happen, presumably there's enough. I mean, it could be very slow, but presumably people get information about what their prospects are as university graduates, and people base their decisions on that information. And presumably it's going to change over time. So the demand for university, I would have to imagine, in the long run. I mean, there may be lags, so there may be kind of short-term disequilibria where people aren't going into the fields where the jobs are. But in the longer run, you certainly imagine that there's enough information flowing around that people aren't going to go to university if the prospects are really getting worse. And again, in the enrollment numbers, it's not there. I mean, you're just not seeing that pattern at all in the data. University enrollment is as high as it's ever been, right? So this may change in the future, but it doesn't seem to be yet.
Is it higher?
Well, it's always increasing, right? It's always rising. I mean, a lot of it's international students, but there hasn't been any decline, that's for sure, right? As far as I know. I mean, in Ontario, university enrollment is continuing to rise.